Thank you, Emily. So we are here today to talk about the Youth Nature Keepers program. It is national scale sort of initiative. Currently, we have 6 participating provinces across Canada where we engage youth defined as people from 15 to 30 years old in a variety of initiatives, all related to invasive species management, awareness, and oftentimes education. So I want to start by talking about the thought that went into the design for the program and what we believe sets it apart from other similar programs. Here, I want to talk about the challenges and this very non-apologetically stock image of a bored teenager is a stock image because I generally had some trouble finding images of bored teenagers amongst our own records. I think when we started planning for this program, we started identifying what some of the most significant barriers were in getting youth engaged. And some of the things that we identified include eco-anxiety as a barrier to engagement, disenfranchisement, or the feeling that nothing that youth can really do will have a meaningful impact, feelings of isolation, that the feelings behind a lot of these barriers are unique to them, nature essentialism. This one's an interesting, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but basically the idea that nature is this static thing that needs to be a specific way, and that divergence from it is somehow bad or sometimes even evil. Burdening expectations and resentment, something that is very unique or a common factor amongst younger generations, particularly younger millennials and Gen Z, and it's looking like Gen Alpha will be right with them, is this sense that a lot of the issues that we have been identifying and understanding better throughout the late 20th century and early 21st century are now quickly becoming the responsibility to solve. And that often leads to a big mismatch in what older generations expect from their youth and what youth believe their duty or their legacy should be. Competing priorities. So we are a nonprofit. Youth Nature Keepers is entirely a volunteer program, and oftentimes when youth want to participate, some of the bigger barriers are other priorities that they have in their lives, either because they need to commit to things that will actually generate an income, which we are unable to provide through this program specifically, but we do try to address those things. Or if they are younger and they're still in school, high school, university, college, oftentimes they are under very heavy expectations to have a certain type and a certain amount of extracurriculars. And oftentimes those expectations become really heavy burdens on the side of their families, on their academic records, on what they project their academic careers to be like going forward. And this is doubly so true with disadvantaged communities that have unique barriers to engaging with programs such as these. Oftentimes, they have to travel further away. Oftentimes, they have different responsibilities in how they need to take care of their families. This is true for Indigenous participants. This is true for newcomer participants. This is true oftentimes for LGBTQ participants. Those tend to be more, we tend to see those more in disadvantaged communities or underrepresented communities. And an information overload. I think one thing is that that we've noticed is a lot of these initiatives, because we come because all of us tend to be educators, and because we all come from this background of wanting to communicate ideas behind issues that we understand, that we want to transmit, we often front load the information. And the truth is, a lot of these youth have already been exposed to at least the basics of a lot of the concepts that they end up facing. And their understanding of a lot of these concepts is oftentimes quite advanced. Not every time, but oftentimes it's quite advanced. And then when we start putting information on top of that, it becomes just another class or another burden that they're just supposed to learn and absorb. Next slide, please. So I want to start by talking about what we understand of as youth-led. Youth-led, I think, is becoming very quickly a buzzword. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that that makes the exposure of this term is having its meaning somewhat diluted. And it's being diluted because it comes with a certain expectations. Youth-led is a term that you will often find in a variety of grant applications or objectives set up by other initiatives. And I think part of the design here was trying to figure out what youth-led actually meant and trying to come up with some of the issues behind it as a concept, while trying to keep the intent of why it has become so popular and why we want to prioritize youth-led initiatives. Oftentimes, we've found that matching the expectations of what we have from a concept such as youth-led with actually empowering youth is actually very incompatible. Throwing, I think Emily is going to go a little bit more into this, but just throwing youth the task almost of, hey, we want to support you in doing the projects that you want to do. So why don't you propose something, and we'll support you in that. Is a lot of pressure. And I think the intent continues to be good. We are trying to be empowering in doing things like that. But I think in the end, it just becomes another task. It just becomes another thing that they're expected to do. And they're not really feeling a lot of agency with that approach to the science. Another aspect has been involving youth in the knowledge generation process. When we talk about science communication, especially, and the format that youth are often used to engaging with science is the format in which they sit down in a classroom and direction and information flows in a single direction, and they just absorb it as it comes at them. And oftentimes, this isn't really an honest way of engaging if we want to give them the power to develop their own initiatives. So a big part of what I think has been defining for the program has been problematizing some of the same ideas that we are bringing to the table, the things that we are presenting to them, and making room for a type of critical self-examination where we are opening ourselves up to hearing varying perspectives and to hearing kind of like the issues with the way that we frame certain problems or certain approaches. Next slide, please. So I want to go through what some of our grander scope solutions have been, and then as we move on, we're just going to get into more specific examples and what those mean in practice. So some of that has been, that is a lot of the same text. I apologize for that, but it is addressing some of the same questions. So matching the expectations that the youth have with the idea of what agency looks like is a big part of the puzzle. Setting the expectation that the project that they said is going to fix any number of ecological issues is a very, very big expectation and a very big burden. And oftentimes, out of trying to create a sense of excitement, we mistakenly end up sort of implying that the direct impact of their stewardship work is going to create wider scope solutions. Something that I think this project has been really successful at has been in redefining those interventions at a community level so that youth get to define the impact that they want to see in their individual communities. By letting youth be the ones that define the impact and what they consider success in their programs, we are removing the pressure from what I think is the unspoken truth oftentimes, which is that it's going to be on them to solve a lot of these issues. And it lets them perform practices of stewardship on their own terms. That same practice, those same processes through which they define their own projects, they define what success looks like for that project, is also a way in which they end up generating knowledge that is unique and valuable. It is experiential information that they're generating through the development of these projects. And it is also an invitation for them to contribute to the library of knowledge that we don't just want to present to them, but rather make accessible to them in a way that they are able to partake in. One of my favorite examples of this, and I think a lot of people in attendance are going to be familiar with this idea, is the idea of citizen science. Citizen science is extremely empowering because it is a very low barrier of entry. Oftentimes, one of the biggest issues with environmental education and other types of STEM adjacent fields is that there's a lot of gatekeeping. If you don't have a certain degree, if you don't have a certain approach to things, then you're better off like staying by the sidelines. So you're not, or your voice at least is not quite valued. Some of the activities that we'll see further on when we talk about specific examples include surveys and bioblitzes that contribute to common databases, and having youth not only contribute to them, but understanding the value of their contribution, I think has been rather large. Under the lens of inviting a critical self-examination, I'd also include, especially in the field of invasive species, problematizing ideas such as even the word invasive as a lens. It is obviously an extremely useful term. It is a term that we use to refer to a variety of issues that we are all meaning to address, and we don't want to underplay or underestimate the importance of management of these sorts of issues. But exploring the limits of the usefulness of it as a lens is, and having a very nuanced conversation with youth about issues such as this, firstly, allows them to feel like they are a part of the information and they're not just memorizing yet another textbook in yet another class as they have been. It allows them to feel like their ideas or issues that they might bring with their ideas are valid because they are allowed to challenge some of the preconceived ideas. And in a lot of instances, it's also very inviting because language matters quite a lot. And sometimes we end up communicating things without realizing to youth that close those doors or those avenues of interrogation. And this, in a way, leads to a very nuanced conversation for the youth to become engaged in. The sort of involvement that youth are, and I would argue other populations, are able to experience with any given topic is more meaningful the deeper it goes. In the case of invasive species, we often fall into the trap of essentializing nature. By privileging scientific perspectives, we tend to follow the scientific practices of categorization, which of course are useful and of course are important to know and learn. But we end up simplifying things in doing that by putting, for instance, species in very limited boxes, such as this is invasive and this is native and this is naturalized. We are oftentimes boiling down things to what just can be learned or memorized. IDing species becomes a matter of determining which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones. And oftentimes the issue with that is that it doesn't lead to any sort of deeper engagement than that. In contrast, having an approach where we are focusing on understanding the overall health of an ecosystem and not so much casting judgment on any given species, but rather focusing on understanding what the role of any given species is in any given ecosystem is a much deeper engagement with the topics that we tend to discuss. So instead of just focusing whether the species is bad for an ecosystem, more so wondering why the species is currently out of balance or currently changing the ecosystem around them, tends to be, even just on the surface level, a lot more interesting. It allows us to engage with stories. It allows youth oftentimes to place themselves in the ecology around them and have their involvement be more meaningful and deeper. Next slide, please. Another thing that we had discussed briefly is how oftentimes, because we have these heavy expectations on youth as a whole, oftentimes these expectations are internalized to some degree. So when we talk about stewardship, I think it's important to acknowledge that stewardship is hard. Not only does it oftentimes involve us getting up really early in the morning and going out in cold or wet weather and stomping through wetlands to remove Phragmites or perform any other types of management activities. Sometimes the youth have this outsized expectation of what that impact will be. And then they'll look back at work that they've been doing for several hours, and they'll try to measure the 10 feet by 10 feet plot that they've been working on in that time. And that can feel extremely defeating because the issues that we are facing, all of them, or at least most of them, understand, are occurring on a global scale. So the idea that any given stewardship intervention is going to have a meaningful impact can be a bit of a barrier, or it can be self-defeating over a long enough term, and it's hard to maintain. This goes paired with the fact that the more you learn about ecological concepts, the more you start seeing them in your everyday life, and this can also be a painful experience. Learning to identify invasive species makes it harder to ignore them when you're walking through the park and you realize this whole ravine is overrun by buckthorn, where before I only saw trees. And I think the natural reaction to that is to oftentimes recoil and step back from those practices. What we're trying to propose is that stewardship is inherently worthwhile as a practice, not necessarily because the measurable effect it has on wider ecosystems, although collectively it does amount to a difference, but rather because the practice of being present in nature and learning the things that we're learning while being in contact with them is in itself nourishing, in ways that sometimes are hard to describe, but that I believe if you're here with us today, you'll often understand. Not only is the practice itself inherently worthwhile, but the practice itself can often lead to community building. And community building is a way in which we defeat isolation and we allow youth to understand that the things, the often very heavy ideas that come with these practices and these themes and sustainability and ecology and environmentalism, all of these heavy feelings, they're not alone in experiencing. That not only are other youth around them experiencing, but all of us are experiencing as well. And there's something in sharing that that can also be extremely powerful and in a way extremely healing. Having that direct contact, allowing themselves to engage with the complexity of ecosystems instead of simply essentializing them is also a way of developing an investment in the ecosystems around them, questioning things that oftentimes we take for granted, where our food comes from, where our trash goes to, and we start pulling on different threads that end up creating a wider web of understanding of the ecology around us. Removing barriers, sometimes this is extremely practical, sometimes this is just finding ways to allocate resources to help youth that are having trouble accessing certain opportunities to attend them. Sometimes it means opening up spaces that invite populations that oftentimes or often are just not or traditionally are not often seen in these spaces, and trying to understand why. Myself, I am an immigrant to Canada. I'm a newcomer here. I'm originally from South America. And my experience here is that oftentimes the fields of environmentalism and ecology are not particularly inviting towards newcomers. I would argue this is doubly so in the field of invasive species, where the language we use around invasive species is something that often resonates with youth and newcomers in the way that they are received when they first arrived here. And that doesn't evoke particularly welcoming feelings, and trying to find ways to remove those barriers and have those conversations and look those things in the eye. Developing community, as we talked about last, and then also where possible and where appropriate, embracing indigenous perspectives. You think there is sometimes a set of resistances to this, because sometimes it feels as though these things are mismatched in the practices and mm, theories that we have all been trained in more deeply. And I think that those inconsistencies sometimes create a certain sense of a recall. For example, when I tell you, when I speak about problematizing invasive as a lens, a lot of people recoil from that idea right off the bat. But I think that idea doesn't need to mean that we apply any less investment in our management efforts. It just means that we understand them differently. Uh, Interestingly, indigenous perspectives on invasive species often align themselves to this. And I personally think this is quite amazing, that some of the perspectives that come from people which have been the most impacted by outside influence tend to also be the most welcoming and the most focused on understanding the role of what species that have ended up here through no fault of their own might have on their new ecosystems, and seeing those species, even when they create problems, with compassion as natural living beings is something that I find quite amazing and worth learning from. And when there are contradictions, where there are mismatches, having access to both perspectives can still be valuable. I think terms that have increasingly become popular in recent years in conversations surrounding this in the East Coast, it tends to be more known as two-eyed seeing. In the West Coast, I think they refer to it mostly as partial mind thinking. If I'm not wrong, I might be wrong about that. I apologize if I am. And incorporating that and not privileging one perspective over another, but trying to synthesize knowledge and move forward with the tools that are afforded to us by those different perspectives can be very powerful and can make people feel a lot more invested in the topics that we're talking about. Next slide. A lot of this is also about developing trust, and I think you'll get a chance to see a lot more in practice when Chris and Emily speak about their direct experiences with the youth. But it's about asking ourselves honestly and genuinely, how are youth perceiving our message? How do we connect with what the youth are experiencing? And how do we prevent privileging our experience and dismissing others? And I don't think I have a silver bullet type of solution for any of these questions, but I do think that engaging with them honestly and trying to apply questions such as these in the most honest way that we can has been an important way in which we've tried to develop this program. And that oftentimes asks the question, what do we mean? What do we actually mean when we say something? What do people understand when we speak about it this way? What does a specific group understand when we talk about things this way? And sometimes the answer is not easy, but I think that only makes the questions more worthwhile. The resulting program we're going to go into a little bit more deeply, but from a bird's eye view, this is the Youth Nature Keepers program in the short time that we have been active, which is for practical terms since October. Maybe mid-September, we started seeing some enrollment, and in this short time period, we have developed a program which has 3 different ways of engaging. This is part of our efforts to let youth define how they want to be involved. They can either just participate in the ECHO webinars and connect with other volunteers across Canada through our virtual network, which we host on Discord, or maybe they go a step further and they jump into existing in-person volunteer projects and stewardship opportunities where they get to meet people face-to-face and develop their local communities. Or three, they get to propose, start, and develop their own projects, which is the deepest type of engagement, and which we'll talk about a little bit more. We have over 195 youth registered across 6 provinces. Currently, we have a virtual network and a myriad of local communities spread throughout Canada. And we offer a variety of webinars, stewardship opportunities in each of the provinces that we are present. And we have increasingly been moving towards skills development and training, because that is also an area that youth that want to be involved in this field want to learn more about and figure out how to apply to other areas of their lives. And again, this has all happened in just the span of a couple months, and I think we're pretty happy with what we've been able to put together. And I think going more into detail is going to go to you, Emily. So if you want to take over.
Thanks, Val, and hi, everybody. I do have to apologize in advance because my cat has decided now is the time that she wants to throw a temper tantrum. So I apologize for any noises you hear in my background. But yeah, as Val mentioned, a huge part of the Youth Nature Keepers program is creating a community of youth across Canada. But another component of the program is developing youth projects. So, as coordinators, we provide the opportunity for youth to create community projects, whether it's in a group project setting or individual. But we provide them with funding and a structured framework that they can use to get projects started. And the process itself, as Fel mentioned, is somewhat intimidating, especially if youth had never started a project from scratch before. Instead of us being like, okay, ready, set, go with your project and come up with something from scratch, we wanted to create an accessible way for youth to get a project started. And so we created a digital resource called our Youth Project Guidebook. And inside of the guidebook, youth are presented with a few project topics that they can choose from. Or they have the option of creating their own project, which is amazing as well. So the 3 topics that they can choose from is watershed health, ecosystem restoration, and visual media. And within these 3 topics, the youth can select from some of our preset sort of themes. So, for example, watershed health has terrestrial or aquatic invasive species monitoring, it has stormwater monitoring, ecosystem restoration might look like creating a pollinator garden, and visual media, which is actually one of the most popular project selections, can look like creating a photography portfolio, creating a website. I think some of Chris's youth has a blog going. So anything where they can sort of be a little more creative with their projects. And the purpose of the guidebook, like I said, is so that there's a sort of a starting point for the youth to begin their projects. And while we do have this project guidebook, we don't really enforce it as a rule book or you have to follow these steps to develop your project. So it's sort of just an information package to provide the youth. And if they want to, they can choose some of these topics that we've laid out for them. But it's also up to their own interpretation and creativity to take the project in whichever direction they want to. So one of the best parts about providing this resource is the interpretations that the youth come up with. So 2 people who have selected stormwater monitoring for their projects, the projects themselves might look totally different because they're coming at a different perspective. So that's also part of the program. We try to encourage youth to be creative and take their own interpretations from what we've provided, or to start a project from scratch as well. And from there, the next steps are really hands-on on the coordinator team. So we provide them with a planning template. And this is really just kind of the starting point for the project. So they select the project, they go over what the objectives will look like, how they're going to achieve those objectives, what materials they need, funding, and probably the most important thing that the coordinators want to know are these reflection questions. So, why the topic is important to them, what they're hoping to achieve, why they think the project will have an important impact on their community, and how we can best support their projects. So, after they have selected their project, we provide them with another digital resource and information package, which goes over their project selection in a little bit more detail while also being sort of just a starting point for what they want their project to look like. And then we have a meeting with the youth where we learn a little bit more about their project planning template and also what the scope of their project will look like and how we can best support them. And on top of that, we also provide opportunities for youth to collaborate with each other. So this has been really important to sort of let the youth bounce ideas off of each other and collaborate a little bit. We've had virtual brainstorming workshops across the Maritimes, Ontario, the Prairies, and the mountain provinces as well. So that kind of contributes to the idea that Youth Nature Keepers is a network for youth to collaborate, but also sort of see what other youth across the country are doing with their projects. So um, here's a little poster that our amazing communications coordinator, Aiden, created. We want to be able to create inviting opportunities for youth to collaborate in a digital space. And one thing that Fel did touch on briefly is sort of the accessibility component and inclusivity component of um, invasive species or science as a topic. So when we were developing these information packages and project planning templates, we wanted to keep in mind that not everybody is starting from the same point of view or the same perspective. Not everybody has a science background. Some youth are joining as students in grade 9 in high school. Others might be getting their master's degree in environmental conservation. So we really don't know where they're starting from. So because of that, we wanted to make sure that our resources were as accessible and inclusive as possible. So here are some screenshots from some of our guidebooks here. So we have a section for key terms to provide kind of just the basis of what these terms that we're including in these information packages are. So up here we have terrestrial invasive species. Some people might not know what that could mean or what that entails. So, say with stakeholders, we want to make sure that these definitions are accessible and that everyone's starting from the same resource. We also wanted to include project consideration. So that includes stakeholders, what materials we think that they might need to achieve their project. Again, they can kind of use their own creativity and do their own research. But here we have cell phone for photos and species ID or measuring tools for plot monitoring and so on. So a little more context to help achieve their project. We set out a few steps for the youth to go through to start their project. Again, that's sort of what we are thinking might go into developing these projects. Again, they can kind of take it in their own direction. And then here are additional resources as well that might help develop their projects a little bit. And I wanted to do a little spotlight for one of my projects here in Ontario. We have so many great projects across the entire network, but one of my favorites, as somebody who also enjoys going outside and taking photos of wildlife, is a youth from Toronto, Jason, who has developed a digital photography portfolio. So Jason selected the visual media project type and created an Instagram account to showcase his beautiful photography here. You can see he's really talented and has created an entire portfolio just using Instagram as a platform. And another amazing thing about this project is not only is he able to showcase his work, but also a lot of his observations that he's taken through photos has been contributed to community science initiatives as well. So there are some conservation projects here in Ontario, especially for the piping plover conservation program that he's contributed his observations to. And otherwise, he can just use iNaturalist and go in and record that he saw a raccoon in the tree in Toronto or whatever. So it's more than just his portfolio, it's also contributing to community science. And then the other one I wanted to spotlight was youth in Ottawa, Declan, who decided for their youth project they wanted to create an alphabet book of invasive species across Canada or North America and hand drew all of these illustrations here on the screen that you can see. So really, really talented. Super excited that we could create this opportunity for him to showcase his talent, but also to create an educational resource that he is planning to distribute to community organizations and libraries. And I believe he works at a summer camp, so he's planning on using that as a teaching resource as well. And thanks to the Healthy Habitats micro grant program, he was able to secure some funding to get this digital resource printed so we can distribute these copies in person. So really cool. Other youth engagement opportunities aside from the Discord server or engaging in virtual workshops or community projects, we also plan community building events. So that could look like up here on the top left, one of Julian, the other Ontario coordinators. That's his team starting his community garden. I believe this one here is Saskatchewan for their seed bomb workshop. So other really cool opportunities that youth might not have had access to that we're developing in their communities as well. And one opportunity that I'm gonna take this chance to spotlight is my Kitchener-Waterloo Hiking Club that just had its first event last Saturday. We went to the Huron Natural Area. And the whole idea behind these is to get people outside, especially now that the weather's warming up. It's really nice to get some fresh air and spend some time community building. But we also wanted to create some low impact hiking opportunities, learn about some species ID, see some cool things out in nature. You can see this photo here on this tree that Julian and I thought was really exciting, some woodpecker holes, and Julian and I were like geeking out doing species ID and tree ID. So it was a really fun time. So yeah. And on the note of community engagement, I'm going to pass it off to Chris.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. Yeah, so I'm going to be expanding on some of the projects that Emily mentioned there at the end, in addition to the youth-led projects that they're developing themselves. Youth Nature Keepers coordinators develop stewardship projects that youth can participate in, and these are important for giving youth hands-on experience, building community, getting meaningful conservation work, building capacity of local conservation organizations, and maybe inspiring them and influencing them to see what a stewardship project looks like, and maybe giving them the tools to create their own. So I'm going to do my best to highlight some of the projects we've done across the country and do them justice. Like Phil mentioned, we've only been operating since basically October. And as you all know, the field season for doing some of these conservation projects, it doesn't really extend into the winter very much. So we had a small window of opportunity to do some of these projects. And as you'll see, I think we were able to do a lot of cool stuff. So yeah, I'll start out east in New Brunswick, where I'm based out of, then move west to highlight some projects. In New Brunswick, one of our larger projects we've done has been the Hemlock woolly adelgid monitoring program. If you're not aware, Hemlock woolly adelgid is an invasive aphid. It's not currently in New Brunswick, but it's surrounding us. It's east of us in Nova Scotia. It's south of us across the border in the States, and that's also west in Ontario. So it will be in New Brunswick, and the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council thought it was very important to create this monitoring program and establish a network of trained practitioners, youth volunteers, and other individuals who live and or work on the land are able to identify eastern hemlock and woolly hemlock adelgid and contribute to early detection and hopefully rapid response when we do see these buggers in New Brunswick. So I organized a workshop in Moncton in partnership with CFIA. And this workshop was just to train local conservation organizations, indigenous groups, our Youth Nature Keepers volunteers and other practitioners on how to identify hemlock woolly adelgid, why it's important to monitor for this pest. And then after that workshop, we went to Mapleton Park in Moncton and did some ball surveying, which is pictured here on the right. So basically, ball surveying is you have a ball and you glue Velcro to the ball, and then with a gigantic slingshot, you fire these balls into the eastern hemlock canopies. And then what hemlock woolly adelgid does is he forms these little woolly balls, and that sticks to the Velcro. And then when the ball returns to the ground, which it does 98% of the time, you can inspect the balls and see if any of these woolly balls stuck to the Velcro. So we did that in Moncton. Then I also led a hemlock woolly adelgid monitoring program here in Fredericton in Odell Park, which has old growth stands of eastern hemlock. And then that's pictured there on the left. So next slide, please. Awesome. Some other work we've been able to do in Fredericton has been a couple of invasive species removal projects. This one pictured here is at Fredericton Botanic Garden. They have a beautiful property, but along the edge, it's surrounded by forest. And in that boundary between the forest and the garden itself, it's just buckthorn. So in this picture here, all the yellow leaves you see behind the volunteers there, that's 100% buckthorn. So I identified a pretty dense patch of buckthorn, and we virtually removed all buckthorn from that patch. We had to stick to a confined space because if we didn't, we'd be pulling buckthorn forever. So once we removed, as you can see pictured here, we removed all the buckthorn, and then on the ground, it looks almost bare soil. That's because there's pretty much 100% buckthorn there. We did 3 different treatments to the buckthorn. One was we cut them off at the stem about 6 inches above the ground and just left them. Then another one, we used a tool called the extractigator to remove the entire buckthorn from the ground, root and stem. And then the third, similar to the first, we cut it off 6 inches above the ground, and then we zip tied on these buckthorn baggies pictured at the top right. And that'll help solarize and hopefully kill the root system and prevent offshoots from going up around. So yeah, hopefully in the spring, we're going to return to this piece of land and monitor and see which treatment worked best. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another invasive species removal event we did was at Hyla Park. This is owned by Nature Trust New Brunswick, who stewards a bunch of properties around Fredericton. In Hyla Park, there's trails, and along the trails is buckthorn, which is pretty common of invasive plant species that like to grow along trails. So we removed the buckthorn along this trail corridor. They also had a patch of Japanese knotweed that they tackled in a previous year and tarped out. After they removed the Japanese knotweed, they put tarp over top. But Japanese knotweed this year just grew up around the tarp. So that's kind of what it does. And we came and we helped them remove that Japanese knotweed. Next slide. I'm moving on to Ontario now to highlight some of the amazing work our other coordinators have been doing. This is the awesome Buckthorn Busters project that was coordinated by Julian, one of the Ontario coordinators. And this plot of land, pictured at the top right, is owned by the Ontario Heritage Trust, and they were given permission to come in and do some invasive buckthorn removal on the property. So Youth Nature Keepers volunteers and Julian aren't just removing invasive buckthorn, they're also surveying for buckthorn and mapping out where it is on the property. So they're going around and they're identifying dense patches of buckthorn and using mapping technology to create a map that'll be used to inform future invasive species removal on the property going forward. I wanted to highlight the number 1 pictured on the map there. Julian says they identified butternut trees in that patch there, which is an endangered tree in Ontario. And so that was a high priority area for them. And they came in the fall, which is the big picture here, and they removed the buckthorn kind of surrounding and within that butternut stand, just so it doesn't overtake the butternut. And he said they removed hundreds of buckthorn. And now this project is actually 100% youth-led, I believe. Julian kind of coordinated this, but then he handed off the reins to some of his volunteers in Aurora. So very cool project. Next slide, please. I'm going to move, continue in Ontario. This is in Toronto. If you're not familiar with Toronto, there's a large natural park and environmental significant area close to downtown Toronto called High Park. And it's heavily trafficked. And a thing with heavily trafficked natural areas is that they're prone to getting invasive species. So this park, High Park, has a population of invasive Phragmites. And so in collaboration with High Park Nature Center volunteers, fellow organized for youth nature keepers volunteers to come in and participate in a Phragmites removal. So they taught them how to identify Phragmites, why it's bad for the environment, uh, and then how to properly remove it. So that's a very cool opportunity. I believe Youth Nature Keepers' first in-person stewardship event. Next slide, please. Awesome. I'm moving more west now into Saskatchewan. So Reed, the coordinator of the Saskatchewan program, did this seed bomb creation workshop. And so if you're not familiar with seed bombs, they're little balls of soil and clay with a native plant and grass seeds. And basically, this seed bomb was established in Europe, I believe, as part of a guerrilla gardening movement. So these seed bombs you can just put on bare soil, and they take and they're pretty successful in growing. So what they've done in Europe is they go past vacant, unused, empty lots, and they throw these seed bombs, and then they transform this useless space into pollinator-friendly habitat. So with her volunteers, they created almost 100 seed bombs, and I believe they're going to be going out within their neighborhoods in spring to do some guerrilla gardening. Also pictured at the bottom right there is a river cleanup they did in the Mewison River in Saskatoon. So as you can see, they were able to successfully remove a large amount of trash from the Mewison River. Next slide. I don't have time to highlight everything we've done, but I just want to talk about some of the initiatives nationally that Emily mentioned briefly. These are the Nature Walk series and BioBlitzes that Alberta, PEI, and Manitoba have been able to do. And these are awesome initiatives to get youth outside in nature and able to identify native and invasive species. You know, it's well documented that youth don't get outside as much as they have historically, and that's to the detriment of their physical and mental well-being. So these are awesome initiatives. The picture on the left is Alberta. In the middle here is PEI BioBlitz, and on the right is a volunteer in Manitoba who's taking an invasive buckthorn for later removal in spring. Next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. And I just briefly want to talk about going forward and some projects I have going on here in New Brunswick. So as you can see in this picture, that's a huge patch of Japanese knotweed. Come spring, in partnership with the city of Fredericton, we're going to remove this patch. We're going to do 2 treatments. Half of it we're just going to chop off at the ground and then return and keep chopping as the knotweed grows up. And on the other side, we're going to remove the Japanese knotweed, lay it down where we cut it, and then the city's going to come on and cover with wood chips, and we'll be able to see which treatment works best. We're also going to be installing some emerald ash borer traps with the city. Fredericton's street trees are mostly ash, so emerald ash borer poses a huge threat to Fredericton's infrastructure. So we're going to be putting up traps to identify which trees are at risk and should be inoculated. We're going to return to the Fredericton Botanical Gardens to do some more buckthorn monitoring and upkeep of the patch we tackled there. Continue with the hemlock-woolly diligent network. And then there's also in March, we have an event with the Nash Rock Watershed and to do some willow branch harvesting at their Neils Flats property. So you basically cut off willow branches and you stake them along the riverbank. Willow trees can grow just from the branch, and that'll help stabilize the riverbank. So yeah, those are some of the stewardship projects we've been able to host for our volunteers to take part of. And again, in that small window between October and basically by the time snow started flying. So I think it was a quite successful launch to the program, and we were able to do a lot of cool and important conservation work.